Get started. First of all, I would like to welcome you to the 2023 Futures Conference. My name is Tammy Hughes, and I'm here with my co-host, Sam Song. I'm coming to you from Duquesne University, and I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. I would like to recognize that Duquesne University occupies the ancestral land of the Adena culture, Hopewell culture, the Monongahela peoples, who were later joined by refugees of other tribes, including the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Haudenosaunee. All were driven here from their homelands by colonizers. And as we get started today, I welcome you to bring in your land acknowledgements and put them in the chat. You'll see there's a link for folks to put their land acknowledgements in. Sam, were you going to do a labor acknowledgement?
Thank you. We'd also like to acknowledge the labor over the years of exploited workers and enslaved peoples, primarily of African descent, and other immigrants, indigenous people groups who have contributed to the society that we live in now, and the exploitation that continues to this day. So we want to acknowledge the number of communities, including women as well, that have gone unacknowledged over many years.
Thank you. And so we have a brief orientation before we get to our main show today. So first of all, we wanted to start off with, what is the Futures Conference? Maybe some of you are new to it. And so we wanted to go through a brief history. The School Psychology Futures Conference is an event that we hold every 10 years. And it started in 2002. Our second one was in 2012. And our third one is 2022. I mean, just kidding. It's 2023. And we were delayed because of COVID, also delayed because of our focus on wanting to make this the best one ever. But the beginning of Future started off with a dedication to improve the lives and outcome of children and families across the globe. One of the major outcomes of the first Futures Conference in 2002 was the formation of the School Psychology Leadership Roundtable. The Leadership Roundtable has two major functions. First of all, was to bring together leaders from all of the constituent organizations, at least annually. And we have met every year at NASP and APA. And our purpose is to communicate to each other what we're doing, combine efforts where possible, and to continue to promote positive outcomes for children, families, and schools. The second part of our charge is to organize, monitor, and facilitate the implementation of specific goals that have come out of each of the Futures conferences. This year, we are taking up a new approach. For many years, starting with at least the Thayer Conference in 1954, national organizations have come together to think about the priorities of the field. And really, we have been internally focused in those conversations. What's different about this year and this 2020 conference is we are looking externally. We are trying to focus on the broader social inequities. And there's going to be a very strong focus on using a social justice lens to do that. So this is the first time that the Futures Conference has had planning by a steering committee. And that means by all of the organizations, school psychology organizations, of course, the leadership, educators, practitioners, and students, when we can get the students to join us on their schedules. But we took up this Futures Conference with an idea of reimagining what school psychology could be, what the future of school psychology looks like if it was to use a social justice lens and to serve all kids. So I'm thrilled to introduce today Celeste Malone, who not only brings to us her vision and her leadership, but to also acknowledge that she took our steering committee on a very similar journey that you're about to begin today. And we grappled really for months about how to broaden our own professional development, how to best support each other as we learned hard lessons together, and how to grow in our approach to helping kids in schools. And so when Celeste starts her conversation with you, I just want you to know that we too have started on that journey, and we feel like we're joining you in that. So just as a little bit of orientation, let me take you through the way this next year will look. There are several pillars. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sam. I forgot to say thank you.
Yeah, also just wanted to acknowledge all of the sponsors and collaborators. These are all the major organizations in our field, and the leaders who have contributed in addition to the steering committee. The steering committee team and the technology team, of course. So we want to also just acknowledge that several people rolled off the committee because the planning did take a number of years. And so thank you for those of you who are still remaining and continuing on for the next year. And also for our interpreters, Sharon Pierre-Lewis and Amber Bertolut. So we thank you for being here with us.
So the steering committee's approach to taking up this social justice lens was to kind of group our thinking into different areas of practice where we already are, and thinking about how we would like to make it different. So the first pillar is around leadership. And every one of our pillars, you'll see there's a definition and then some questions that we're posing to you to think about and reflect on as we go throughout the semester or through the year. So leadership, what does it look like for all of us in school psychology? Do we have the demographics within school psychology to influence who will become the next leaders? And how do we cultivate the next generation of leaders? And you can see there's a couple of questions below that.
The next pillar is science and scholarship. And the definition here is maintaining the breadth and depth of school psychology knowledge base and expertise. And the key questions that this group has identified are here on the screen. How can science and scholarship further inform school psychologists' efforts to support the development and success of all children, especially children from culturally and linguistically diverse contexts? What are key considerations for researchers and practitioners to contribute to a scholarship that advances diversity, equity, and inclusion, including supporting scholars of color? And what is needed in the field of school psychology to further advance science and scholarship that advances diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Pillar 3 is about the practice of school psychology. And what they're asking us to think about is, how are the systemic and structural oppression, or the effects of systemic and structural oppression, present in today's daily practice? This is really thinking about, what do we do now, and how would we want to think about doing it different? So in number 2, you can see there, how have we been complicit in maintaining the structural and systemic oppression that occurs in our school systems? And once we are able to think about that and reflect on it, what kinds of action would we like to take in promoting and engaging in more culturally responsive and socially justice practices?
Pillar 4 is education and lifelong learning. And here's the definition for you: providing educational experiences at the graduate and continuing professional development level to develop and advance the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to effectively serve diverse youth. Key questions here, 2 slides. How does school psychology as a scientist practitioner field balance the need for understanding foundational theory and as well as the need to ensure competency and technical skills? How do we ensure that both new school psychology professionals and career school psychology professionals not only understand what we do, but also why? How does understanding evolve throughout the career? How do we empower school psychologists to recognize the need for ongoing professional development, as well as recognize the barriers to ongoing growth? Does the scope of the specialist master's level of training produce high quality and competent school psychologists? And what is the added value of a doctoral degree, or is there another way to provide advanced training? What provides or enhances value, and what is necessary and sufficient?
We have workforce development, which is really about increasing, maintaining, and advocating for well-trained, diverse school psychology workforce. The questions from this group will be, how can we increase awareness of school psychology as a specialty of psychology? And how can we ensure that the workforce reflects the diversity of students and families that we serve? In what ways do school psychologists feel a sense of job satisfaction? And how are we as school psychologists promoting liberation within our training programs and in our practices to support the children and families that we serve?
And the final pillar is advocacy, facilitating systems change to promote equity and access to education and mental health care. The questions here are, what role does advocacy at various levels play in the future of school psychology? What skills and focus are necessary to be an advocate for equity as a school psychologist? How do identity, positionality, and power impact advocacy ability and efforts? What are different styles and approaches to advocacy in school psychology? What skills and tools can be used to navigate any negative consequences, such as retaliation, for advocacy efforts? So those are the pillars for the conference for this next year. And now's the time to have our Dr. Celeste Malone, our keynote speaker, who really does not need any introduction because everyone knows her and has really learned a lot from her. The whole field has, in terms of her leadership in NASP and other organizations, and just in the field writ large. So please join me in welcoming Celeste Malone. Welcome, Celeste. We're going to do a screen share swap. Okay. All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this kickoff event for the 2023-2024 School Psychology Futures Conference. As stated, my name is Celeste Malone. I am currently the president of the National Association of School Psychologists, and I'm faculty at Howard University, which notably is one of two historically Black universities with a school psychology program, and the only one with school psychology at a doctoral level. I had to plug that in. And so, as Tammy noted, this Futures Conference will differ from previous training conferences in school psychology in two very important ways. One is the deliberate and thoughtful inclusion of the global school psychology community. So not just having a small group of individuals setting the future of the profession, but rather promoting engagement of school psychologists of all training levels in all areas of practice and around the world, not just limited to the United States. And then the second way this Futures Conference differs is the intentional focus on examining school psychology from a social justice lens. As part of our social justice focus, it is important for us to be on the same page when it comes to social justice concepts and terms, as well as for us to be self-reflective to better understand how social justices manifest within school psychology and how our practices have contributed to educational and mental health inequities. This talk is titled Blue Sky, because we're trying in this conversation, moving away through the clouds of injustice. What are the aspects about our history, as well as our current practice, that have clouded our vision and stand in the way of our idealized future? As part of this talk, I'm going to take a historical perspective around school psychology and education. And as part of that historical perspective, I will be including quotes from Black school psychology leaders who have talked about these issues and have painted a picture or a vision of the direction school psychology needs to go in and have done this work for decades. So I'll highlight their work in this conversation, as well as contemporary research describing inequities within the profession. And then I'll close with some additional questions for us to consider as we navigate through our futures journey across this next year. Over the past several years, school psychology has made significant strides toward promoting social justice. In 2017, the National Association of School Psychologists adopted this definition of social justice that is on your screen. It was developed by a task force comprised of researchers in school psychology who have a background in multiculturalism as well as social justice work. This definition presented here highlights many facets of social justice, including the importance of a systems perspective, the use of non-discriminatory and culturally responsive practices, as well as advocacy on behalf of others with less social power and privilege. In the summer of 2020, in the midst of the United States reckoning with racism following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the profession of school psychology made a commitment to use psychological science to combat systemic racism and foster change at all levels, including pre-K through 12 schools and school psychology professional spaces. Noted here are some highlights from the Declaration of Understanding. The importance of us acknowledging that we have to confront our own internalized racism as well as implicit biases, confronting those explicit biases that we see in pre-K through 12 schools and in our graduate training programs. We make a promise to support and protect our children of color who are disproportionately targeted. And then finally, this last bullet, calling out those within our profession that act in ways that are antithetical to the values that we espouse in our Declaration of Understanding. This last bullet, it highlights our collective responsibility to hold each other accountable and support each other as we work toward racial justice. I want to do a deeper dive in the NASP social justice definition. And presented here is the first sentence, the one I hear quoted most often, that social justice is both a process and a goal that requires action. And there's a lot of focus on the action part. It is beyond clear the need for social justice action is urgent. We have an ethical responsibility to use our expertise to correct the unjust practices that marginalize some students and advocate for school climates conducive to the well-being of all students. But in our rush to act, we may forget that social justice is also about process. It's not just about what we do, but how we do it. Without understanding who we are, what we believe, and what we value, there's a potential to harm the groups that we want to help, and the potential to replicate oppression as we're working in the pursuit of equity. So to take a deeper dive at this, what is the process of social justice? It's intentional inclusion of affected communities, that we're not just working on behalf of groups, but any group that we're seeking to support, we are bringing them into the process and we're intentional about doing so. And then we demonstrate cultural humility, that school psychologists have a lot of expertise when it comes to mental health, child development, and how students learn and educational systems. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there's limits to our knowledge and that the communities, the families, and the students we serve, they're the experts on their experiences, and we need to learn from them. So we have to be thoughtful of how we are working with those impacted and affected communities and making sure that we're not stepping on their toes and determining what the goals are. And then speaking of goals, the goal is liberation. I often hear people say that the goal of social justice is equity, and equity is the minimum. We want all, but we really want all students, families, and communities to experience liberation and to be seen as fully human. And what do I mean by liberation? It's a world that is free from interpersonal, institutional, and internalized oppression. When we live in a liberated society, meaning that we're no longer affected or impacted and harmed by oppression, that will result in equity and access to opportunities as well as outcomes. But as we pursue our work in social justice, recognizing that equity is just a starting point, the true goal is to dismantle the systems that are preventing equity in the first place. And then finally, how are we acting? That our role is to empower and work alongside affected communities and challenge unjust systems through advocacy. Social justice is not passive by any means. And again, it's not just highlighting what these problems are, but what are the steps that we are willing to take? What are the sacrifices that we're willing to make in order to achieve the goals of equity and liberation? Because ultimately, the goal of social justice is to dismantle oppressive structures and open pathways to liberation. And presented here is a definition of oppression. For many students, particularly those with marginalized identities, schools have been sites of oppression. The current socio-political environment has made things even worse. I want to highlight a few key things in this definition of oppression. First, asymmetric power relations. We have a predominantly white educator workforce, and I include school psychologists in this number, working primarily with racial and ethnic minoritized youth. These educators hold positions of power and privilege due to their job roles, but they also hold power due to their privileged sociocultural identities, and they exert that power over students and families. There's inequitable access to educational resources and opportunities based on school location and demographics. And deficit beliefs about marginalized students are reflected in their treatment at school. Racism is the oppressive system or structure that we probably hear about most often, but it is not the only one. We have to be cognizant of oppression based on race, but also on gender and gender identification, sexual orientation, ability, social class and socioeconomic status, age, country of origin, as well as other sociocultural identities. We also have to consider how these oppressive systems intersect and build upon each other such that individuals with multiple marginalized identities are placed at even greater risk for oppression, discrimination, and harm. Within school psychology and education more broadly, we focused on single access frameworks, which ignore the heterogeneity within identity groups and assumes that identity categories such as race, gender, and ability are standalone in their impact on students. When we examine racism, sexism, ableism, and other forms of oppression, there's often a greater focus on this interpersonal level. For example, microaggressions or discriminatory treatment, without recognition of how oppression is embedded within our structures through institutional policies and practices, or how individuals internalize oppression. Those who hold marginalized sociocultural identities, such as racial and ethnic minoritized individuals, LGBTQ individuals, disabled individuals, these groups are regularly deprived of opportunities and material resources through different rules and structures, again, that limit their access to opportunities and resources. And so as a result of those limited opportunities, start to internalize an inferior sense of identity that my group doesn't have because somehow we are not deserving. That's how marginalized and minoritized communities internalize oppression. At the same time, those who hold privileged sociocultural identities, for example, white individuals, heterosexual individuals, and non-disabled individuals, they see how other groups are treated and are being denied access to different opportunities, and then start to develop deficit-based biases about those groups. Those groups don't have the resources I do because they are less deserving, and my group is more deserving. That's how people develop, or groups rather, develop unearned privilege. They form their identity at the expense of others. The National Equity Project created this graphic as well as a full report to demonstrate how bias, internalized senses of oppression, can lead to structural racism and other inequities. Let me start with implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to a positive or negative mental attitude towards a person or group that we hold on an unconscious level. We all hold implicit biases, and they're shaped by messages we receive about groups that prime us to view them either positively or negatively. Over time, we form mental associations. And then when we see a member of a particular group, we assume that they fit our mental association. And so to describe a little bit about how this works, I ask you to consider race. There is no biological basis to race. Race is a social construction that was used to justify the enslavement of Africans and the forced displacement and colonization of indigenous peoples. So when we think about the words that were used to describe and are used to describe non-white individuals, such as savage, lazy, or dumb, they were used to present non-white individuals in groups as intellectually inferior, thereby justifying their enslavement and colonization. These words, such as savage, lazy, or dumb, are also tied to disability, thereby linking disability and race, such that those who are racially and ethnically minoritized, that was pathologized in a way that being a person of color is almost like being treated or is treated as a disabling characteristic. When we look at history, policies, and practices, the laws that were put into place to ensure that racial and ethnic minoritized individuals remain second-class citizens within the United States. For example, it was illegal to teach enslaved Africans to read, as well as illegal for them to congregate. When we think later on, after emancipation, the use of literacy tests for voter registration, and fast forward to today, modern day voter identification laws and other policies intended to restrict access to voting. Consider also redlining and housing segregation, forcing racial ethnic minoritized individuals in more crowded neighborhoods with limited resources. When we think about how property tax, it funds education, and with the siloing and again, deprivation and denial of resources to racial ethnic minoritized communities, siloing them in one neighborhood and then drawing on property taxes to fund education, that's led to underfunded and under-resourced schools in racial and ethnic minoritized communities. And then disparate treatment leads to disparate outcomes. And those disparities that we see further reinforce deficit-based implicit biases. The same model or process rather plays out in educational systems. And so first thinking about the priming associations and assumptions, the research has highlighted that teachers' racial attitudes reflect those held by broader society. They endorse pro-white racial implicit bias, explicit bias, as well as symbolic racism. When we consider history, policies, and practices, school discipline practices predominantly focused on policing minor and subjective behavior, along with vague definitions of discipline infraction categories, facilitates bias and enforcement. That school policies are developed based on which students are assumed to be more deviant, more dangerous, and more in need of policing or their behavior to be controlled in some way. We see this in disciplinary practices, as well as dress code policies. And then differential treatment leads to differential outcomes. Black, disabled, and LGBTQ youth are disciplined more frequently and more harshly in the categories of disrespect, disruption, and defiance, those subjective offenses. And Black and Indigenous students are overrepresented in special education and are placed in more restrictive settings. And as I noted previously, the disparities that we see with regards to education further reinforce deficit-based implicit biases, and then the cycle continues over and over again. So as I was preparing for this talk, there were a few quotes that stood out to me from previous school psychology research, including this one from Dr. Trevor Sewell, who was a professor in my alma mater, Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and was a leader in APA Division 16. He was a participant in the Olympia Conference, which was the next major training conference in school psychology after the Thayer Conference, which was held in 1954. Dr. Sewell was asked to write one of the reaction papers for conference attendees to react to. And this quote stood out to me. The question that is increasingly being brought to our attention is the extent to which theories, instruments, and models conceptualized in the interests of the dominant cultural group and generalized to minorities, despite glaring differential cultural experiences, can be used to fulfill the goals, aspirations, and quality of life to which minority children strive. Within this quote, as well as the paper in full, Dr. Sewell questions the tools, the techniques, and the modes of knowledge construction in school psychology. Can we truly serve marginalized communities in the absence of engaging in culturally responsive practice? This is a prompt for us to examine the cultural norms and mores that are embedded in school psychology and really ask ourselves, are they serving the communities that we strive to serve? And so with that, it's important for us to consider the process of bias and structural oppression within school psychology if we're going to look towards creating an anti-oppressive and socially just future. First, starting with priming associations and assumptions. Leitner Whitmer and G. Stanley Hall, both of whom are considered to be the founders of school psychology, were both known to have endorsed eugenicist ideas in their research and their professional work, meaning that they were part of that broader legacy of scientific racism that APA, the American Psychological Association, recently apologized for. They developed instruments, as well as their students developed instruments to distinguish who was worthy and who would benefit from education. And those instruments, those tools, many of which are used today, have been used to exclude racial ethnic minoritized groups, as well as other marginalized communities from fully accessing education. Those deficit biases about minoritized groups also affect our recruitment and retention. That it's been a long-standing issue, the lack of diversity within school psychology. And one of the recruitment strategies cited in the literature frequently is targeted recruitment from minority-serving institutions, including historically Black universities. However, department chairs, psychology department chairs from HBCUs reported that they received very little outreach from school psychology training programs, meaning that this recommendation in the literature, school psychology programs weren't reaching out to HBCUs or minority serving institutions or recruitment. That may be part of beliefs around those institutions themselves and seeing them as lower quality. Because additional research in school psychology suggests that school psychology graduate students from HBCUs receive microaggressions from their school psychology faculty that suggests that their education was inferior because they went to a minority serving institution, as opposed to a predominantly white institution. And so these deficit perspectives about marginalized communities, again, what happened in society more broadly is within school psychology. School psychology is a microcosm of society, and these deficit beliefs or biases about minoritized groups is affecting our recruitment as well as our retention. We also have the belief that diversity topics are not important to school psychology. For example, the Thayer Conference, which was the first professional conference in school psychology to define the field as well as education and training and scope of practice. It occurred in 1954, the same year as the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Yet in the proceedings of the Thayer Conference, there's no mention of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. There's also no mention about diversity, about culture, those terms are not indexed in the Thayer Conference proceedings. And this suggests that issues around cultural context were not perceived as a key influence for school psychology standards. That also relates to the limited coverage of multicultural topics in school psychology training, as well as in research, and the continued use of problematic and culturally neutral or purportedly culturally neutral practices. And again, this has led to inequitable outcomes. The limited growth of racial ethnic minoritized representation in school psychology across all levels. This takes me to my second quote, and this is from Dr. Elizabeth Abramowitz, who a school psychologist, also trained attorney, who served as the second executive director of the National Association of School Psychologists. She was also solicited to write a paper for the Olympia Conference in 1981. It is almost impossible to tell if there were recessions, riots in the streets, taxpayer revolts, declines in pupil populations, parental distrust of educators, and dissatisfaction with public education in general, increased racial polarization, and declining test scores from the reality that is pictured in the school psychology journals. Public concerns, for the most part, are not incorporated in the professional concerns of school psychologists. And throughout this reaction paper, Dr. Abramowitz highlighted that school psychology, we've taken a culturally neutral stance, and somewhat on purpose for the sake of objectivity, that in our desire to be seen as a scientific area, that we excluded or ignored anything that we couldn't quantify, including culture. And that led to the production of knowledge within school psychology without appropriate context. And so knowledge being produced about students, some students rather, without situating that knowledge in its appropriate context. And a focus on describing social problems that exist, but little interest in actually solving these social problems to make things better for marginalized communities. And these are a few key points looking at multicultural and social justice research. While published diversity research in school psychology journals has showed a steady increase from 1975 to 2003, the number of diversity-focused populations is still inadequate, especially when we consider the racial and ethnic diversity of the pre-K through 12 student population. And so from some studies looking at school psychology research, that when we look at school psychology as compared to special education and school counseling, we publish significantly less diversity research. School counseling during the same period examined published twice as much diversity research as school psychology. In the most recent review of diversity research in school psychology journals, a little over 15% of school psychology journal articles address diversity in some type of way. And again, that's a growth over the past 40 years, but it's not close to being enough. In an analysis of social justice research within school psychology, they found that the social justice research focused on highlighting and describing inequities, but not as much about addressing root causes of oppression and how they lead to social inequities, or describing the importance of advocating on behalf of specific cultural groups. And then finally, there's limited representation of socio-demographic variables in school psychology research. When we look at our school psychology intervention research, scholars are routinely collecting information about race, but what about the other variables that make children different, such as their ability, sexual orientation, we know socioeconomic status, we know less about those areas. And as a result, we don't know if our research is representative or reflective of the populations that we're wishing to help and support. And then the limited diversity research based in school psychology affects graduate education and training. Best practice for multicultural and social justice training within school psychology is the use of both an integrated, meaning that multicultural and social justice content is integrated throughout the curriculum, along with a separate course, and tying that with relevant field experiences. But mine and a colleague's research have found that only about 3/4 of school psychology programs offer at least one multicultural competence course. So there's still about 1/4 of school psychology programs not offering any standalone coursework specific to multicultural or social justice topics. And then for those school psychology programs that have this coursework, it's often taught outside of school psychology. And so it may be unknown how relevant that content is to school psychology practice. In a study I did recently, most program coordinators reported using an integration model, meaning that multicultural and social justice content is integrated throughout the curriculum. However, only about 2/3 of faculty participated in any multicultural training post-degree. All of this sends the implicit message that multiculturalism and social justice are not distinct competency areas within school psychology, meaning that they don't have a distinct core of knowledge or skills associated with it. And that devalues the knowledge base related to culturally responsive and social justice practice. We're not providing graduate education and training aligned with best practices, and we have to question or consider, are faculty competent to teach this content? Because there is no way that we would allow a school psychology faculty member to teach an assessment course, but have not completed any professional development and assessment since they graduated. Yet, we have school psychology faculty saying that they teach multicultural content, but they haven't done any professional development or ongoing training in that area. And then further, most programs espouse using an integrated model of multicultural training, but there's limited integration of multicultural topics in core coursework. So based on syllabi reviews and assessment, consultation, and supervision, only about 10 to 15% of course content in those areas focuses on diversity. And even so, it may talk about specific groups, but not going into that deeper dive in related to injustices and inequities that are experienced. And then my last quote comes from John Jackson. Dr. John Jackson, who was Director of Psychological Services in Milwaukee Public Schools and a pioneer in comprehensive school psychological services, especially service provision in urban school districts. And he was active within APA and Division 16 leadership. This is a quote from a chapter he wrote on multicultural school psychology. The functional perspective of psychological services delivery has been and continues to be based on the assumption that middle-class Euro-American cultural standards are superior and preferred. Given this perspective, school psychology, along with other behavioral sciences and health services during the last half of the 20th century, described minority youth as culturally deprived, culturally different or distinct, and culturally neutral. And so within this quote here, Dr. Jackson really highlights the deficit perspective of minoritized groups and communities within school psychology and other helping profession, and the assumed superiority of white norms and values. And now we're going to consider how this may play out in the profession a little bit more. So let's look at who school psychologists are. School psychology, we are a profession of primarily white, non-disabled, and English monolingual professionals. As a profession, school psychology is less diverse than the US population as a whole with regards to race, linguistic status, as well as ability. And we are markedly less diverse in the school-age population, which is a little bit more than 50% non-white at this point in history. When we see these demographics, we care about them, not just because of the cultural identities that are held, that is important, because our cultural group membership shape how we view the world, but it also changes or influences our social locations, who has power and privilege. And when we look at these demographics, we have to consider, how do these demographics influence our notion of who school psychologists are, or who can be successful in the profession, or who could be a leader within the profession of school psychology? The lack of racial and ethnic diversity in school psychology has been a long-standing issue within the field. From its origins, school psychology has been overwhelmingly white, and there has been slow but very limited growth in school psychology, leaving us a very homogenous profession. And these are data from NASP member reports. And so again, from the earliest membership survey, about 4% racial ethnic minoritized school psychologists, and over a 40-year period, we're just at about 11%. This stands in contrast to the US population as a whole, and then significantly, markedly different from the pre-K through 12 student population. We have to consider the following. How has the lack of diversity in the profession of school psychology impacted the way that we address culture? And why has it been such a challenge for us to diversify the profession? The persistent lack of racial and ethnic diversity in school psychology is concerning, considering that diversity drives innovation. For example, having more diversity within school psychology graduate cohorts is that exposure to different perspectives and worldviews, and is associated with increased multicultural competence. So by having that exposure, we learn about views other than our own. It helps us to be more cognizant and self-reflective of our own worldview, and helps us to develop cultural humility as we recognize the worldviews of others. Society as a whole also benefits, because when we have different and diverse perspectives at the table, that shapes the questions that we ask and what we pay attention to with regards to research. And when we have more diversity within our profession, it'll lead to increased research on racial ethnic diversity and social justice issues, as well as cultivating a workforce that is seeking to serve the communities most in need of our help and support. So leading to improvements in both practice and research. But unfortunately, racial ethnic minoritized professionals face a number of challenges within school psychology. First, with the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in the field, graduate students of color in particular don't have as much access to racial and ethnic minoritized role models. These role models are important to help them imagine possibilities for their future selves in the profession. Not only is there a lack of role models, but the existing representation of race and ethnicity may be grounded in stereotypes. Deficit presentations of racial and ethnic minoritized individuals and communities in psychology research. And these stereotypes shape interpersonal interactions through microaggressions that convey that racial ethnic minoritized students or professionals don't belong in academic spaces or in the profession as a whole. This also impacts access to mentoring and supports, that racial ethnic minoritized graduate students and professionals are excluded from academic social spaces and are less likely to receive the same quality of mentoring and support and advising as their white peers. So these experiences may cause racial and ethnic minoritized professionals to leave at a higher rate. And so I want to highlight this table here, and it's looking at racial ethnic diversity within the profession, graduate students, as well as school psychologists, those already in the field. So when we look at our graduate students, we've had significant growth, where our most recent data highlights that a little over a third of school psychology graduate students are members of racial and ethnic minoritized groups. But although we have had this increase of diversity within our training programs, we haven't seen the same change within the field as a whole. And so these experiences may be pushing racial and ethnic minoritized individuals out of the profession of school psychology. This leads to fewer providers, exacerbating the workforce shortages that already exist, as well as a loss of talent to develop culturally responsive practices. There's limited demographic statistics available when we look at other school psychology demographic characteristics, such as sexual orientation and disability. But when we look at the research around, the budding research around school psychologists who are identified as LGBTQ, and then from psychology as a whole, disabled psychologists, we would suggest, or it's reasonable to believe, that there are the same barriers that exist that are pushing out LGBTQ school psychologists, disabled school psychologists, and other school psychologists who hold minoritized identities. So over this next year, as we do this deeper dive into each of the respective pillars, we have to ask ourselves, as school psychologists, how have we been complicit in maintaining oppressive systems? We have to ask ourselves this question and be willing to engage in this deep and sometimes challenging reflection if we really are serious about incorporating social justice in school psychology and having equity and liberation for the students, families, communities that we serve, as well as for ourselves. So when it comes to advocacy, what causes do we consider important, and how do we advocate along minoritized communities? For our science and scholarship, what knowledge and forms of knowledge production are valued within the profession? Our practices, are they harming or helping minoritized communities? And how can we promote culturally responsive practices? Looking at the workforce, what are the structural barriers that are limiting access to the profession? Who can access leadership positions? And how do school psychologists engage in socially just leadership in whatever position they hold? And then finally, education and lifelong learning. How do we prepare school psychologists with cultural humility and dispositions toward social justice? And so as we address these questions, along with the other pillar questions over the course of the next 12 months, it will help us to have a brighter vision and push aside the clouds so that we could really imagine a just and liberated future for school psychology. And so with that, I turn it back over to Sam and Tammy.
All right, we have some, thank you, Celeste. Round of applause in the chats and Q&As. Some Lori Unruh is up next. Lori.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate Sam, Tammy, and Celeste giving us this really comprehensive framework for our work together this year. And Sam, go ahead and go into the next slide. So I want to remind everybody, this is just our kickoff event. We've got many more opportunities to explore further the information that was presented to you today. I'm just going to highlight for you again some of the things we're going to really focus on as we continue to work on this throughout the next year. So a couple of things here. First of all, this is not a one and done event. So it's not just what you heard today. We're going to have a lot of other activities available to you over the next year. So we hope that all of you will continue with us. Last I heard, we had close to 500 people who had registered to participate with us. We're hoping to get even more. So I'm hoping that after today, many of you are going to go out and promote this to some of your friends as well. Tell them it's not too late to get involved. The second point here, you're going to have the choice to get engaged at whatever level you want. There's going to be lots of different activities. There's going to be webinars like this. There's also going to be discussion PowerPoints that we're going to be doing. There's going to be opportunities to engage in Padlets. There's going to be opportunities to do reading. So lots of different things. You'll be able to decide what it is you want to do and how you want to engage with it. For example, you might just decide there's certain ones of these pillars that you're particularly interested in. You're going to focus on those, or you might want to dive into all of them. It's up to you. Also, as a reminder, if you miss something as we keep going this year, you're always going to be able to go back and review archived webinars, readings, participant sharing. All of these things are going to be posted on the website. So that website, keep it handy, keep it linked so you can get to it, because the information in there is going to just continue to grow and develop over the next year. Sam, go on. Yeah. So another thing is to keep in mind as we engage in this journey that there's going to be lots of opportunities for discussions where, some tough things may be discussed with each other. We're going to have a lot of different perspectives. Hopefully our thinking is going to be challenged as we move forward. So in the website, we have posted some community agreements, some things for you to think about in terms of how we can respect each other as we go through this journey together. And along with that, we have also posted a video from Janine Jones that highlights these community agreements. She does a really good job of giving you some ideas of how to engage in difficult conversations. So I'd encourage you to go into the website and take a look at that. You are also encouraged, all of you are encouraged to set some individual goals for yourself. What is it that you want to get out of this journey of us looking at the future of school psychology? Not only what you hope to get out of it, how can you maybe contribute? What do you have to contribute to others in across the country and internationally? We should include that we are international with this conference. What can you contribute, and set some goals for that? And either for yourself individually, or in some cases, you may have groups of school psychologists who want to work on this journey together and want to be able to spend, maybe have some of their own group goals within their districts, within their universities. So think about that as well. When you get to the end of the journey, this will be hopefully in April next year, we're going to be encouraging everyone to develop a plan of action as well. And as a steering committee, we're going to be putting together kind of all of the summary of information that was discussed and sharing that we get from all of you into some final documents that will help us as we guide us as we look in terms of what is this going to mean after we get done? How are we going to use all this information? So this last slide that Sam has up here is looking at our next steps. So first, just to remind you that at the beginning of each month, as we go through this next year, you're going to be getting what we are calling a travel guide. You received one in June, which helped you understand what was going to be happening in June. And you're going to get another one at the end, probably of next week, for July. And you're going to get one of these at the beginning of each month. Within those travel guides, there's going to be lots of information, but there's going to be 2 links I want you to be aware of. One is called a participant sharing Padlet link. So each month there's going to be a new Padlet, and you're going to be asked in these Padlets to think about actions. So like for this Padlet that we're going to have for the month of June, in other words, for response to what Celeste just shared, some of the things we did as part of this kickoff event, we're going to encourage you to go into that Padlet and think about what actions might you take related to this, or what have you already taken, and what are some of the barriers we're facing, or what are some of the successes we've had. So each month we're going to have opportunities for that in relation to each of the topics for that month. In addition, there's going to be this travel log link. We did not have one for June. This will be the first one in July. And mainly what it's asking you to do is go in and very briefly, it shouldn't take you more than 5 to 10 minutes. And we really want you to participate in this. Let us know what you engaged in. So we're telling everybody they can do whatever they want with this conference for the next year. We would like to know what it is that you did do. So in July, you're going to get one that we're going to ask you during the month of June. As part of the kickoff event, where did you attend it live? Did you attend it virtually? Did you engage in any of the readings? What are some of the key takeaways you got from this? And that's going to be information we're going to use as a steering committee to help us understand how people have been reacting to this, what they've been learning, and guiding us both in terms of as we continue to plan this, but also in terms of our final documentation of everything at the end of this conference. So look for those travel guides. Keep that website handy. I should also add that Sam has put together a YouTube channel. So we're going to also have all of our video clips available there as well as on the website. So again, lots of different ways you can access the materials. And just to let you know, pillar number 1 is going to be the webinar for July, and it's going to be on leadership. And we right now have that scheduled for a live webinar similar to this one on July 13th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, again, Eastern Standard Time. We'll have resources posted in the website by July 1st that will allow you some readings, some podcasts, those sorts of things. And in that live webinar, we'll talk about the history of leadership in school psychology. We'll talk about some of the current activities going on in terms of leadership in school psychology, and then we'll look at the future. And then after that webinar, we're going to continue that discussion about the future through probably 3 or 4 live Zoom discussion groups where people can choose one of those to go to. It'll be a smaller group, and we can discuss further the things that were shared during the live webinar, which when we have a large group, it's sometimes harder to have good discussions with. So we'll send the dates that are going to be for those a little bit later on. If you don't want to join these live discussion groups, you could set up discussion groups within your own location, so like in your district or within your university. And if you're interested, we can share with you some of the discussion guides for those as well. So be looking for all that information, and hopefully you'll be able to continue with us on this journey on the future of school psychology. Sam, you want to wrap it up?
Tammy, I don't know if you wanted to join in.
Yep,
every-
yep.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, we're here to wrap things up and just to highlight that we are really trying to share engagement with everybody. The steering group committee group members are going to be leading many of these pillars, and we very much are looking forward to the feedback from the audience. And so we see you as equal participants and seek your feedback and how things are going for you and what you've learned. So please join us both virtually and live when you can.
Great. Thank you all again. We'll be following up with a quick evaluation as well. Thank you all.
Thanks for coming.